Hello again, everyone. It's Mike Yao once again. I used to do a video about once every 2 months, and now I'm doing one every day because we're all stuck at home in self-quarantine. So why not do another one? So this is mainly for the Kickstarter page again, although I'll probably end up putting on the website as well and the Facebook company page for more people to see. So this one, the first one in sort of the series that I'm doing this week, the first one was character creation. Some of you might have already saw that one. The very recent one posted this morning was magic and sorcery in Savage Kingdoms. And this one, the third installment, is combat and battle and martial exploits in the world of Savage Kingdoms, third edition. So, as most of you know who have played tabletop role-playing games for any length of time, combat is one of the major pillars of the game, so to speak, because it is very exciting. Medieval warfare is very intriguing, and a lot of fantasy literature contains lots of really cool skirmishes and battles and all-out, full-scale warfare. Um, and single combats and duels and stuff like that. So it's all very intriguing. Savage Kingdoms is really no different. I do, having written the game, I do try to put more emphasis on story and role playing. But to speak on that for a second, a lot of people separate combat and role playing and other aspects of the game as completely different, and I disagree with that. You're still in character in combat. You're still play. Your character doesn't suddenly change his or her personality because you're in combat. And I know that's hard to distinguish sometimes because once combat begins in many game systems, including Savage Kingdom, suddenly initiative is rolled or some game mechanic thereof, and then things sort of slow down, but also speed up. Meaning that in real world terms, the game slows down a little bit because you're making tactical decisions. It should slow down much actually, but it does. And but in the sense of the game, maybe only 6 seconds are occurring every combat round, such as in D&D, Pathfinder, and Savage Kingdoms is no different. Savage Kingdoms used to be 5 second combat rounds in the previous edition, so 12 rounds for a minute. Excuse me. But I decided that, I'm just going to make it 10 seconds, 10 rounds in a minute. It's a lot easier. Also, since we went to the two action system, it divides really well. So basically, you can imagine every action is roughly 3 seconds or thereabouts. So combat and role playing should never differentiate. I thought I'd throw that out on a side note before I really start delving into the combat mechanics of Savage Kingdoms. So keep that in mind. Every game system and setting supports the crunch on top, the rules on top, and I think some people look at it vice versa. It's like, oh yeah, we have all these cool numbers, and yeah, there's the story stuff that's kind of on the side. It's like that's actually not how it really works. It's actually vice versa. You build the mechanics are supporting the underarching the story. The meat of the setting and of the game system is really the what some people would say the fluff, which is kind of derogatory because that's it's not really fluff at all. That's really the meat and potatoes right there. The game mechanics just help bring it into a game system that we all are at a table doing and interacting with. It's just a way to interface with the story. So having gotten that out of the way, so combat in Savage Kingdoms is it should be very story based, part of the story. Hopefully, combat happens for a reason. It's a very dark age of sword and sorcery setting, so there's lots of ways combat can happen. Single combat is one of my favorite, or duels in a more modern sort of sense of the word, where a champion is facing another champion in an honor duel, and no one really supposed to, without breaking a serious breach of conduct, supposed to interfere. Maybe an apprentice warrior or a squire could throw his champion a weapon or something at some point, but that's about it. Or maybe take his wounded horse away at some point. So those are very thrilling scenes. Those are one of my favorite sort of combats is single combat between two champions. The most typical form of combat, such in most tabletop role-playing games, including Savage Kingdoms, is probably the skirmish level combat. So those are battles between, a group of 5 to 10 versus 5 to 10, maybe a dozen, maybe a 20 at the most. That's the typical thing. A party of adventurers averaging, say, 4 or 5 adventurers. Maybe they have one or two henchmen or a local guide or henchman or scout that they've hired. Suddenly they run into an ambush of brigands hiding in the woods, and suddenly it's a skirmish level combat. So that's, I'd say 90% of your combats and tabletop role playing are skirmish level, to use military terms. So then the next level above that would be your battle scale. So these are larger scale battles between hundreds, um, perhaps even really small sieges of, say, a very small village or a very small fortress might include this level of combat. Um, Speaking of which, there are no mass combat rules. I actually have some in the work, but I don't think I'm going to put them in the core rule book. I believe they're going to appear in the second book, which is Savages. So just know that I do have, Savage Kingdoms does have mass combat rules coming out. I'm pretty happy with them. I played. There's a couple little weird things that I'm changing. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out. The biggest change is that when you get to what I was just talking about, battle level or warfare level or siege level combat scenes, those instead of 6-second rounds, they become 1-minute rounds, at least in Savage Kingdom. So just to kind of let you a little bit thing. That's really the main thing. Once you switch it to that, meaning that so you're still only getting the 2 actions over the course of a minute. And what that represents is A, kind of common sense, but B, it's having fought in some medieval reenactments, and I'm sure some of you as well, or if you've studied medieval warfare, read up on it, etc. Some of these massive battles. Now, some of the stories go that they lasted for days. That's probably pretty rare. The only time that would occur is if the 2 massive sides met, particularly in siege combat when they're trying to siege a stronghold. They might fight for hours and call a truce and just go back to their respective camps. And then the next day they get up and fight again. And this may occur over the course of several days. But apparently that's extremely rare. I mean, it's happened. It's been documented. Some of the documents, particularly from the ancient Greeks, are a little kind of overblown. The Romans kind of typically did that as well a little bit. But the core of what they were saying was almost always true. They just might have inflated the numbers a little bit. So that's why Savage Kingdoms, when the mass combat rules do come out, that's really the main thing. They just go to a minute. And kind of what I was getting at, the reason it's you only still get the 2 actions in a minute is that if you know you're going to be fighting most likely for even just 10 minutes in armor, if anybody's ever done, it's very tiring. Swinging a pretty fairly heavy weapon or 2 or bearing a shield that's 7 to 10 pounds and 50 to 70 pounds of armor and other gear, even if it's just like simulation armor, like from some live action role playing games where the armor is actually more for looks or scale. Not all of it. A lot of it's still real, but costume armor, as I call it, it still simulates to some degree kind of what you're going through. What a medieval warrior would have been going through, a medieval soldier. So if you know that you're fighting 10 minutes to an hour, perhaps several hours, particularly if you don't really have anybody in reserve, you are going to pace yourself. The stamina system again comes into play pretty well, I think. Here, if you were to have 1 action every 3 seconds through minutes or possibly hours of combat, you would be completely exhausted after like a minute or 2 at the most. Particularly how the stamina system works in the game. So that simulates the fact that I'm going to be fighting a lot, and also simulates a lot. There's a lot of sort of downtime sometimes in mass battles. People may not realize is that if you're on the front lines, there's a lot going on, but there's a lot of, if you're wounded, you typically shuffle back and you sort of fall back into a second or third line and rest. Or if it's serious, you may try to have to find a battlefield medic or physician. Most likely that ain't happening for a while, so you just gotta go rest and suck it up. So that's what would be considered downtime. You're kind of shuffling off to the side, kind of regaining your composure, looking at your gear and your wounds, just seeing how bad they are, and just kind of gaining your wits through the fog of battle. So all that kind of stuff represents such things as mass combat. But enough about that right now. So because that's probably in a later book, I just kind of want to hit on that note to sort of preface everything else. So as it is right now in the core rulebook of 3rd edition Savage Kingdoms, combat, like I mentioned, is more at the skirmish level. The rules would support sort of maybe some smaller battlefield level shenanigans as well. without going to the 1 minute system and the other little things that are going to be put on there for mass combat. So right now, at its core, Savage Kingdoms combat is skill based, just like the entire game. So your main skills that you would be using in combat, player characters and non-player characters and monsters, etc., would be the melee weaponry skill, the brawling skill, and the range weaponry skill. Those are kind of your main ones. Acrobatics comes into play to some degree because your dodge defense is actually based on your 10 plus your acrobatics total modifier in that skill. Some other indirect skills would probably come up: perception to detect the enemy, etc. Resolve might come up, particularly against supernatural foes. A fair amount of creatures and supernatural creatures, demons in particular in Savage Kingdoms, have a fear effect, a fear aura about them. Tried to make the game a little more grounded fantasy, a little more believable. And there's some creatures that, for example, in Dungeons and Dragons, that people just kind of ignored, like how scary they would be. But in a setting where things like that are a little more rare and grounded, it would be pretty terrifying even to see an animated skeleton, something that clearly should be dead by all natural orders and laws of things, suddenly lurching to life, and it is like assaulting you with some rusty weapon, or even it's just bony hands. That is pretty would be pretty unnerving, and would warrant a resistance roll against fear. In this case, usually it's resolve. Resolve is based on your willpower. Endurance might come up too, like trying to resist the poison that some enemy smeared on his arrow or something like that. So, but in general, you're going to be using melee weaponry, probably maybe brawling, and range weaponry are kind of your main, particularly attack skills. So when you make an attack, say you're attacking with a spear or something, or sword, you would make a melee weaponry skill roll, which is based as your physique plus your skill levels in that skill, and then any other bonuses are in the other column. It's all on your character sheet, filled out very neatly. Anyway, all that adds up to the total modifier. Let's say in this case you have +5. So you would roll a d20, add a +5 to it. If that equals or exceeds the defense of the opponent, whether they're using dodge or defense, dodge or parry. Most animals can only dodge. They can't parry. Something like a giant scorpion, I think, has a parry defense because it can actually literally block things with its pincers, and scorpions actually do sort of fight that way, actually. Humanoids, humanoid characters pretty much always have dodge and parry. Dodge can be used in anything. You can use that to avoid melee strikes as well as, and mostly, against ranged attacks. Parry can only be used against in melee. You can't parry an arrow out of the way, with the exception of a talent called parry missiles. Uh, somewhat difficult to get, as it should be, but if you do get it, it's a battle talent. You can actually use your parry defense against incoming ranged attacks: missiles, spears, javelins, thrown axes, thrown knives, etc. The only thing it doesn't work on is like massive things like siege engine boulders or ballista spears, something like that. So massive siege engine missiles would not work with parry missiles. So in general, so that's your two defenses. So by every number that you exceed, there's a little secret about SK Combat that I used to not advertise a whole lot, but I am now because I want to share the rule system with everyone. So the difference by which you score against your opponent's defense sets your base damage in combat. This is how it all works off of one roll. Modified by some weapons have something called armor piercing. For example, a great axe, just an average quality great axe, is +3 in armor piercing. A great sword, I think, is also +3. A maul, a big massive hammer, I think it may be +2 actually. And I'll have to look at the stats, but this is all off the top of my head. So armor piercing just simply adds to the damage. So, for example, say you're wielding a great axe and you hit the person, exceeded by his defense by 5. You dealt 5 points of damage, +3 armor piercing. You dealt 8 points of damage. And that's it. 8 points of damage. 8 points of health damage is subtracted from that opponent. The only other modifier to that would be if the opponent's wearing body armor. If they're wearing armor, say he has 3 points of armor, you subtract 3 from the 8, 5 points of damage. So it's very very quick, especially once you get used to it. Like the first time you do it, it's probably no faster than having to roll damage dice, say for like in Dungeons and Dragons. But once you get used to it, it is like hugely faster, 3 to 5 times faster. There's no oh, now I have to find the other dice to roll, or oh no, I roll 8 of these apparently, and now I have to count them all up. So yeah, this is just one roll. It's figured pretty quickly. Most weapons don't even have armor piercing, and then most, particularly animals, most opponents don't have armor. So really, it's just one. I hit by 6 points of damage. So again, the only modifications would be like armor piercing, or if the opponent was wearing armor. There's a few caveats to that, as it should be. There's some battle talents that can alter that. There's a talent called Bashing Blow. Basically, you're taking this massive baseball-like swing that adds it. I think it costs a stamina point, or maybe 2 stamina points to use, whether it connects or not. And if you do hit or connect, it adds +2 to your armor piercing. So in the story of that great axe, this guy would be swinging +5 armor piercing in addition to his base damage. So that can be pretty nasty. Particularly Savage, the average health of, say, like just a regular common folk peasant is 10. Well, actually, it's really 11. 10 is sort of the base formula. The reason I say it's 11 is that most peasantry usually have either +1 in vigor, or if they're +0 in vigor, they have 1 skill level in endurance. So when we figure out the formula, it actually ends up being 11 health instead of 10. So basically 10 to 12 is kind of your average health. But I've seen player characters with as low as there's this one of my kid players who had his character has a 3 health, just tiny little guy. And his dodge defense is really high, so it's hard for him to get hit. But he finally got tagged the other day, and unfortunately, the character is no more. So yeah, that was pretty sad. But so death so you might know health in Savage Kingdoms and stamina have sort of 2 different numbers. There's a full number, there's the half number when you go to half health or stamina. So that half health number is actually used for 2 reasons. So when you get to half your health, that means you're staggered, unless you have like the grit talent. Staggered means that you suffer -2 to all your die rolls and your defense, as it should be. It means at this point you're fairly wounded, you're kind of banged up a little bit. It's supposed to help somewhat simulate, real combat. The other thing for that second number is that when you go to half that health number in negatives, that's your death threshold. That's when you die. So, for example, we'll say you have 12 health, half of that is 6, and this is all in your character sheet. It's very simple. And you would die at -6. So pretty simple. So basically, you would have 18 health point threshold there, which doesn't sound like a lot, and it isn't, because it's supposed to be a fairly deadly game. But once you start adding armor and your defenses get pretty good, it's getting seriously wounded becomes rarer, as it should be. Armor is a pretty big deal. Shields now in Savage Kingdoms, reason I say now, because in the first previous editions they added to your parry defense, which probably makes the most intuitive sense. But I actually moved them to armor now, which makes maybe not as narratively intuitively once you get used to it, but game mechanically it's so much easier. And I'll tell you why really quick without going into super detail. So when you look at your character sheet under armor and protection, you just simply add up all the numbers. So it used to be before, it's like, oh, I'm wearing a mail shirt, a chain shirt, but then I have a shield that says +2. And so that really went to parry, but then the mail shirt went to your armor to subtract damage. So now when you just look at it, you just add it all together. It's like, oh, mail shirt, 3 points of armor. I got a medium shield, 2 points of armor, and maybe I have a war cap, a war helm, which is 1 point of armor. Add it all together, that's 6. It's very simple. You get hit for 9 points of damage. You look at I got 6 points of armor. I took 3 points of damage. So, and that's kind of realistic in a way, because shields are a parrying device. But having done some study, the way some of the shields were used, particularly kite shields, and the way the Spartans in particular used shields, they used it almost like an extension of their armor. They kept it close to the body. A convex shield sort of enclosed around your body. It almost became a somewhat movable breastplate. So if you look at the way some cultures used shields, it's really just an extension of armor anyway. So that's basically how combat works. So, for example, if you weren't using a physical weapon, a manufactured weapon, and you were punching or kicking someone, or headbutting someone, or elbowing someone, or kneeing someone, that would be a brawling attack. So in Savage Kingdoms, any attack that's not a manufactured weapon is a brawling skill roll. I just touched my face again. Um, so animals are pretty much always using brawling in a sense, with biting or clawing or a tail lash or a tusk or an antler or a stampede attack or something like that. So when a human or humanoid, it's again, they're usually punching or kicking or headbutting or something would be brawling. So brawling does a maximum of 5 damage. So that's another thing. Just to kind of go back really quick, every weapon has, I talked about armor piercing, but every weapon has a maximum damage rating, and that's to keep. In first edition, when I first play tested the game, I didn't have that, and it was completely open ended. And then one time during a playtest, someone killed an ice worm, which is supposed to have like an ice worm, which is a glacial worm, really supposed to be described as very thick hide, and it has like 3 or 4 points of natural armor. But somebody's killed it with a dagger because they exploded the 20 like 3 times. Um, and it's really hard to describe like this fairly short blade like piercing into this massive thick skin creature and killing it. I mean, it legit happened under those rules, but that made me look at and doing some research, into actual weaponry and physics. God forbid, I determined that maximum damage statistic needed to be put on weapons. So in third edition, SK daggers are 10 max damage, short swords 12 or no 15, longsword is 20, etc. Spear is 20, I believe, or 15. Long spear is 20. Um, it goes all the way up to 30 for like a great axe. A battle axe, I think, is 20 or 25. Anyway, so it scales basically 10 to 30 or 35, maybe. So if you use a medium-sized weapon, two-handed, you gain +1 to armor piercing and +1 to maximum damage. Heavy weapons you have to use two-handed. That's by default why they're called heavy weapons, whether they're really actually heavy or not. A light weapon you can use one-handed. If you have the agile weaponry talent, you can use your agility instead of your physique when wielding a light weapon, a dagger, short sword, club, etc. So that's kind of cool, but you do have to have the talent to do that. Otherwise, even with a dagger, you're just kind of like smacking raw strength, and that's an untrained person using like a 1 pound. That's really kind of how they fight. They're not really using any finesse. You're just kind of whacking with it. So I think that's fairly realistic / believable. So brawling, yeah. So you can increase brawling damage because it's only a max damage of 5, as it should be. A fist or kick is not nearly generally as serious as a dagger wound. However, a really trained martial artist can deal just as much as that. And so there is a talent called heavy hitter, and that allows you to. I think it increases your max damage by 2, so you can do up to 7, or it might be 8 actually. Anyway, it increases your max damage by either 2 or 3. And then, like, if you get a cestus, which is a battle gauntlet with spikes on it that gladiators sometimes would use, that also increases by 2. So if you have that talent and that weapon, you can actually deal up to 10 points of max damage with a blow as much as a heavy dagger. So that's fairly impressive. There are other creatures too, like the Sleer, the red Sleer particularly have a bite attack that can deal up to 10 points of damage max. A Chinari's claw attack can deal up to 10, so that's already there. So you might want to ask, what if you have a heavy hitter and you already do max damage 10 with a claw or bite or something? Well, that just simply adds to it. So in this case, your claw or bite attack would be 12 or 13 max damage. Because that's what the talent is. It's just a talent. You learn how to just hit hard. I mean, you train just smacking things all the time. What's the other? Range weaponry. So, excuse me. Range weaponry would be the skill that you'd use, say, if you were loosing an arrow into combat or at a creature, throwing a dagger, throwing a javelin, hurling a spear, or hand axe or something. So, as the name of the skill implies, range weaponry skill is your range attacks, or even throwing a vial of acid. In that case, you actually get to use either your alchemy or your range weaponry skill, whichever you're better at. Because if you happen to be really good at alchemy, it would be assumed that you know how to hold the vials just right, you know how the weight of them go, you know how to sort of aim it just right. So you get to use either of those skills in that case, or even just throwing a rock or something. So again, it would be a d20 plus whatever your modifier is in range weapon, and let's say +4 in this case. So you roll a 15, 19 total. Say your target's defense was 15, so you dealt 4 points of base damage plus any armor piercing. Ranged weapons don't typically have as much armor piercing as, say, heavier melee weapons, as you might imagine. But things like a longbow I think is +1 armor piercing. I think a war sling is +1. A regular sling is just 0. So there are a few things. Also, weapon quality, just to go on that really quick, because this applies to ranged weapons as well as melee weapons. All the stats are considering average quality weapons, which are kind of your typical, 80% of the weapons in the world, basically. An exceptional quality weapon increases your max damage by 1. Master crafted weapon increases your armor piercing by 1. Even a weapon that doesn't have an armor piercing rating, such as like a dagger or a short sword, would go up by 1 because it's so well made. It just is slashing and stabbing quite well. So yeah, Mastercraft increases armor piercing and maximum damage by 1. If you were lucky enough to get a heroic quality weapon, which are often magical weapons, or at least quasi-magical, or just super ridiculously well made, or were wielded by a hero of renown, so that's why they're called heroic quality. That's without looking the stats up, let's see. Maximum damage increases by 2, and I think it's armor piercing by 2. It's fairly simple. The next level is legendary. That's the highest. There's very few things of legendary quality. That would be like we'll say a sword of great renown wielded by a great hero. It was enchanted, and then on top of that, it was made of like some rare metal that nobody else knows how to make anymore. That might qualify as a legendary weapon. That's +3 to armor piercing, and I think the maximum damage goes to 5 instead of just 3. It would be simpler that way, but I feel like I might have messed the math up and just went higher. But anyway, it's a lot, particularly the armor piercing. I mean, for example, a legendary quality great axe would be +6 armor piercing, which is pretty devastating. So yeah, just a little note about weapon quality while I'm talking about weapons. Maximum damage of weapons, I covered that. Armor piercing. Other weapons have other qualities. You'll see it in the chart, the equipment chart. The most common are armor piercing and maximum damage. Max damage, every weapon has that. But some weapons have other qualities or characteristics as well, such as mounted. If you use a weapon that has the mounted characteristic, that gives you another +1 from horseback. So this weapon's made particularly for horseback, like lances, sabers, things like that. So, what's another characteristic? Weapon characteristic would be, well, each weapon is rated light, medium, or heavy. I sort of roughly covered that. Each weapon is given a availability rating or commonality rating. Common. So C means the weapon is common. You can find it just about anywhere. U is uncommon. It's probably can find it in larger cities and towns, but it might be rare in, say, a village or somewhere, or in another culture that doesn't really particularly produce those type of weapons. The next rating is R, I believe, is rare. So rare weapons, as implied, are really rare. I mean, even in large cities, are fairly rare to find, or you could probably find a smith to commission one. The next rating is exotic. So the exotics are really, really difficult to find, even in like a metropolitan city, but you might could find one black market wise or get someone to craft one specifically. But it would probably have to be a expensive master smith that would know how to do that. What's another thing, really quick, before I wrap up here at 28 minutes? Another rating would be, let's see, characteristic of weapons mounted. Oh, prestige. Prestige is kind of cool. It gets overlooked. I still overlook it myself as a game master. A prestige weapon is usually a sword, and that's from history. There are a lot of cultures that if you were carrying a sword or wielding a sword, that was kind of a big deal. There's a lot of steel, there's a lot of craftsmanship involved in a sword, and mainly there's a lot of metal being used, particularly if it's steel or some high quality metal. A spear, it only uses about a quarter or a fifth of that metal. So it makes swords very prestigious. So if you have a prestige weapon that's exceptional quality or better, you gain +1 to your renown if you're carrying it around, because people are like, oh wow, that guy's awesome. But it has to be exceptional quality, not just kind of anything. What's another rating for weapons? Another characteristic, without dragging this out too much. Oh yeah, certain weapons have a tripping bonus. They're better at tripping, +2 to tripping, such as a flail, a whip, quarterstaff. Some of the other polearm type weapons, when you're using the haft, you can trip your opponent. That's actually one way they were commonly employed, actually. Um, so yeah, other weapons are conceal. Conceal is another characteristic, such as typically something like a dagger, something smaller. Would give you a +2 bonus on your sleight of hand if you were trying to like hide it while someone is looking at you, or if you're trying to hide it into your clothing, that would be +2 to your disguise. So that's how that works. Conceal, trip, disarm. Certain weapons gain a bonus to disarm. When you're trying to disarm, flail is a good example. Yeah, I think that's it. There's a couple other little weapon characteristics, but that's kind of the main thing. So in general, in Savage Kingdoms combat, that's how it's work. How it works. The little secret is that it's with a single roll. It's the difference between your success roll and your defense. If you are short of the post defense, then clearly you miss, and it's hopefully described as it the opponent dodges it or parries it or ducks under it or sidesteps it or something like that, depending on what defense are being used. So those little game mechanics actually cue you as the game master and player to narrate actually how it works. So it's kind of nice. Obviously, you can kind of make up whatever, but if you really follow what type of weapon it is and what's kind of being done and what defense is being used, that kind of gives you a clue about visually what's happening. So yeah, I guess I'm going to conclude that at 31 minutes about Savage Kingdoms combat in Savage Kingdoms 3rd edition. Thank you guys for listening, and I guess I'll continue to do some more of these. I know a lot of people don't really watch them, but I'm hopefully trying to grow my channel a little bit and trying to get some more brand awareness out there. So thanks for paying attention, and as always, stay safe and stay sane out there. Talk to you soon.